Welcome to Oh God What Now, the politics podcast that respects our flag, especially in its nice new turquoise, mauve and eggshell white colourways. I'm Andrew Harrison, and on today's show, monarchy in the UK. Are we ever going to have a proper conversation about it? Thoughts of winding down the royals were very effectively squashed in between the death of the Queen and the coronation of the King. But considering the nightmare year that the royal family is having, is it time to set them and us free from this endless soap opera? And are boomers going bust? The generation born between the end of the war and 1964 are finally starting to feel the economic pinch, with higher taxes, shrinking benefits, and what looks like a great generational shift towards the interests of millennials. What's it going to do to our politics? And what's it going to do for the likes of me in Generation X? Here to help me with these weighty issues, I've got two of our regulars. Yasmeen Serhan is a staff writer at Time magazine and officially a millennial, so she will be in charge soon. Hello, Yasmeen.
Hello.
So it's been even grimmer news than usual from the Israel-Gaza crisis over the past couple of days, with the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers by an Israeli airstrike. On the same weekend, tens of thousands of Israelis demonstrated to demand the removal of Netanyahu. I mean, it's almost impossible to pull out any direction from all this, but is there any sight of an end to this horrible episode?
It's very difficult to see any bit of light amid kind of the very grim darkness, starting with the World Central Kitchen incident. I mean, you know, everyone's calling it a tragedy, and it's true, but it was about as tragic as it was expected, because the reality is that we're seeing an unprecedented death toll of aid workers in Gaza. The last count I saw is more than 200. I think the exact count is 203 as of this recording. Aid workers, the vast majority of them Palestinian, have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. So they were all already under immense burden and facing immense danger doing their job at a time where, we have to remember Gaza is on the brink of famine, and the World Central Kitchen actually was providing, I think, 60% of the food aid into Gaza at the time that this incident occurred. So that's just been, completely horrible. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has already acknowledged that the IDF has claimed responsibility for the airstrike. They're saying they're doing an investigation. But I think more than just an investigation, and I feel like I've heard of many investigations ongoing into incidents that have happened over the course of this war, we need to see an actual shift in action, an actual way for aid to be distributed safely, for those to be doing that work to do so safely. So that's, the first thing. With regard to the protests, I mean, it seems to me that it's really, it's kind of showing that wartime unity that we've seen since October 7th is starting to fracture. Now, whether that leads to, Netanyahu's imminent ouster, I don't necessarily think so. I think for the Israeli public, the hostages, the remaining Israeli hostages who remain in Gaza is a huge issue, and their kind of fate is still being subject to negotiations. If and when a hostage deal comes to pass, I think then that's kind of be the moment where we're going to see whether something happens. But, I wrote a piece last week about, or was it last week? Yeah, it was last week, about, why Netanyahu's ouster isn't necessarily a panacea. And there are a number of reasons, but the reality is that the next Israeli election isn't due until October 2026. Now, we know that Israel isn't averse to having early elections. If you remember that time, they had, I think, like 5 in a row over the course of a couple of years. There would have to be a number of factors to force one. One would be the fall or the breakdown of the current coalition. But the other would be, as one expert told me, to see mass protests of the likes that we saw before October 7th last year with the judicial overhaul protests. I think this protest is an indication that that could happen, but I think we're going to have to see a lot more of it before it forces any kind of change.
Okay. Also with us is Rafael Behr, Guardian columnist, and a fellow Gen Xer in his Blair t-shirt and his Maharishi trousers. Hello, Raf. How you doing?
I'm repudiating the trouser allegation, but I'll take Blur over Oasis in that particular head-to-head any day of the week.
The correct answer is, of course, Pulp. Fun news over the weekend, Raf, as a Best for Britain poll using the fabled MRP techniques, predicted the worst general election performance in the history of the Conservative Party. If it's correct, they're going to be down to 98 seats, with none at all in Scotland or Wales, and Penny Mordaunt, James Cleverly, Grant Shapps and Rishi Sunak himself could all lose their seats. Now, I know we're not supposed to jinx it, but what happens if we experience one of those eclipse of the liberals moments, one of those kind of once in a century turnovers?
I mean, you're right. First of all, it would take a heart of stone not to laugh at the prospects of that. Some of us, those of us who remember election night of 1997, staying up watching Michael Portillo go, watching Margaret Thatcher's old constituency turn Labour. There is just a visceral pleasure sometimes in regime change of that nature. So we're allowed to hold out the hope that that's what it's going to look like. Look, and in the same way, I mean, you mentioned the collapse of the Liberals at the beginning of the 20th century, and I remember also Geoffrey Wheatcroft, a conservative-leaning journalist, in 1998, I think, published a book, "The Strange Death of Tory England," which was a deliberate reference back to Dangerfield's book, "The Strange Death of Liberal England," suggesting that an equivalent epochal shift, abandonment of a once hegemonic party was happening. And then sure enough, the Tories did eventually crawl their way back to power. So the default assumption has to be that the Conservatives are such an established, entrenched feature of British political history. They just come as a bundle with the establishment, the institutions. They are part of the upholstery of Westminster. And so it's very hard to conceive of them being properly sort of torn out. That said, I do think that Rishi Sunak's failure is more profound than people are sometimes giving it credit for, credit not being the word. I mean, I credit it. I'm very happy with it. But no, because I think people just think, well, he was dealt a terrible hand and maybe he's not quite all he was cracked up to be. He was a bit oversold. But actually, I think there is a kind of exquisite precision to his badness at politics. That means he is sort of exactly enough of a kind of hostage to the fanatical Suella Braverman reform adjacent right to really alienate soft liberal Tories, the kind of people who voted for David Cameron, and also enough of a kind of weak, lackluster Cameroon clone. He actually brought David Cameron into the cabinet to really tell all the populist, radical, nationalist right, Farage adjacent people that he's not their guy and he's appalling and he's ruining everything. So he could be really sort of forcing basically a massive partition of the Conservative vote between the Lib Dems and Reform, and into that gulf, actually, who knows where the bottom is? And so actually, in that sense, although there's a certain kind of fashionable noise around MRP polling because it's a relatively new technique and it does deliver sometimes these extraordinary looking swings, we certainly can't exclude the possibility that this is an extinction level event heading towards the Tories.
Well, I don't want to jinx it, but if it happens, our mug will say, "Congratulations, Agent Sunak, mission accomplished." Before we get started, a tiny reminder that you are the ones who keep Oh God What Now going. We wouldn't normally do this kind of thing, but advertising is becoming a fair bit tighter in the podcast world right now, so we need to ask you for extra help via Patreon. If you're already a backer and you can afford to go up a tier, then please do think about it. A small increase from you makes a big difference to us, and you can do it right now while you're listening. It's on the app, in your hand, on your phone. Just go to memberships on your Patreon page. It's very easy. If you're not a backer yet, now is the time to start. We've got a very big year ahead with big plans for the election, and we need your backing to make it all happen. And of course, if you've been part of the massive influx of supporters so far, huge thanks to you. Everybody else, search Patreon Oh God What Now to find out how to join in. You'll be helping to ensure that we are here and gloating when the great day comes, as it surely must. Now, the royal family, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. We don't talk about them much on the podcast because the sort of people who listen to this podcast probably aren't that interested. But many of the people who are fascinated were left feeling rather ashamed last month when the reason for Kate's mystery disappearance turned out not to be an exciting newspaper-filling piece of palace intrigue, but the fact that she, like the king, is being treated for cancer. It put the soap opera aspect of royalty in a very unforgiving light, and it raises questions of whether a good reason to wind down the monarchy isn't just its deeply questionable constitutional role, but the cruelty it imposes on a cast of characters who, mostly, never even chose to be there in the first place. Raf, you're from the woke, lefty, disloyal Guardian. What did you make of all the columnists from the royalty-addicted press cursing the trolls and the conspiracy theorists for doing what those columnists actually do all day long anyway, spinning royal stories out of nothing?
Oh, it's not the first time that particular hypocrisy has been on show. I mean, if you remember in the week after the death of Diana, it was the media institutions, the paparazzi that were perceived to have hounded the princess to her death. And there was a very effective sort of volte-face that happened from the tabloid newspapers that had run all the pictures and all the exposés of, and really sort of reveled in sort of eating away at Diana's privacy, what little of it there was, suddenly turned it into a kind of ma'am, show us you've got some heart, piling all the pressure onto the Queen and the palace for not getting with the national mood of grief. So, these kind of maneuvers that will enable people and that bit of the press that is obsessed with royalty to try and have its cake and eat it, being both incredibly intrusive, prurient, aggressive when it needs to be, and then unctuously deferential and presenting itself as sort of champion of the venerable institution. I find the whole thing, both sides of it, utterly grim, to be honest.
I mean, this is shaping up to be the worst year probably since that time, the death of Diana. We've got two key figures are seriously ill. One of them is supposed to be at the centre of the next generation. The previously popular Prince Harry has pretty much cut himself off, and then you've got Prince Andrew lurking in the wings. Is it froth, or is this a real crisis in the institution? Because it's kind of hard to disentangle the cast of characters from the constitutional meaning.
Yeah, I think it's never froth because the constitutional thing is real. I mean, ultimately, this is a sort of an argument I do tend to have with people who try and dismiss it and say it's irrelevant, or who think it should almost be beneath them to even pay attention to it. Ultimately, British laws don't become laws until they've had royal assent. The Prime Minister is ultimately a royal appointment. It's a crown appointment. And when we have a general election this year, it'll happen because Rishi Sunak goes to the palace and asks for that dissolution. And although that all happens as a matter of course, what we discovered, if you remember the prorogation, of course you remember the prorogation crisis.
Who doesn't? Yes.
In 2019, these crown powers are vast and sweeping, and ultimately there isn't much codification or constitutional arrangement that really clarifies how they're wielded. And so while the apex of political democratic power in this country resides in that institution, you kind of have to care. I think also that another element of this is really a sort of cultural backwash from the end of a very, very long stable reign. And ultimately, for nearly everyone alive today, the institution of the monarchy and how that functions and what that represents is Queen Elizabeth II. And so, what's happened after that, because she was a genuinely venerated figure and an old lady, sort of towards the end, hovering above everything, politics and culture. And so unlike fame or celebrity as it's played out with the usual celebrities, she wasn't a Kardashian, she was a queen. I think what we're seeing now is the younger generation, Harry and Meghan, but actually to an extent, William and Kate. They belong more to, there's a bit of a blurring between the line of royalty and its constitutional function and just very, very famous people who get treated a bit like celebs, but celeb is not royalty. And when the one sort of blurs into the other, that really puts the institution in danger, I think.
What do you stand on it? I mean, I realize I'm just assuming because you're a Guardianista that you're a pro-British Republic type person. What do you stand on it yourself?
I am a Republican, and I have been. I've actually pretty much for as long as I can remember, but also I very much fall into the category of people who pick their constitutional battles, and I'm a Democrat, and in the absence of any meaningful clamour to get rid of it, it's very, very low on my list of changes I would make to the way Britain is governed, because I just think there are more urgent things that need changing. And also I think it's a mistake for those, particularly on the left, who despise monarchy, to sort of think there's something appallingly deferential and obsequious, and somehow the people who care about monarchy are sort of trapped in false consciousness and need to emancipate themselves. I think it's actually entirely normal and very widespread for something that has been part of the fabric of a national identity for a very, very long time, and an institution representing immense continuity, to exert a kind of magnetic hold over the society and the culture, that people don't want to just destroy it without knowing what would replace it. So it doesn't provide a service like the BBC or the NHS. So you can't put it in that category. But I think it's quite reasonable and rational for people to think, well, it's been there for a long time. It gives us a sense of stability and continuity. Why would we get rid of it? I don't object to that position.
Yasmeen, I mean, when you look at the wall-to-wall coverage of the royals, as the tabloids always call them, like that's their surname or something, do you look at it and go, what kind of a weird country have I come to live in here? Because there is the nearest equivalent in the United States is Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that yours is the only country that is gripped by the royal mania. I mean, I work for an American publication, and the interest in sort of where is Kate Middleton and that whole saga was just insatiable, which is really a shame for me as someone who really, has the privilege, the luxury of not really having to care a lot about the royal family, because, to Raf's point, it's not like they're, my country doesn't have this sort of constitutional figurehead that, even if you dislike them, you kind of have to kind of pay attention to or have a position on. So, yeah, I mean, there's immense interest, but I think to the point that you were just making with Hollywood, I think American interest in the royal family is very much akin to like these are celebrities, which, is an argument that's a bit easier to make now when you see someone like Prince Harry, who's married to, an actress like Meghan Markle. But I mean, even without that, I think Americans' intrigue in that is very much on the basis that here's this like relic. It's quite quaint. A lot of the emails I got during that, I mean, I only wrote a couple of stories really looking at kind of the whole debacle over the Photoshop and what it does to sort of press trust with the institution. But a number of emails I got from readers, and I don't often get emails from readers or from Americans opining their views. So there's very much an immense sense of interest, even if we have different reasons.
But what sorts of views? Kind of like investment in them. It's easier to be heavily into the royal family when they don't have any kind of legal role in your life.
Yeah.
They are, as you say, just another cast of characters in a different global soap.
Well, my favorite email that I received was, I almost wonder if I can just pull it up without naming the person. It's a woman called Gail. I'll just name her by her first name. But she emailed me, and then the message kind of veered as though she was addressing Kate directly. But she said, please get well soon. You have done nothing wrong. Just concentrate on getting well. I've been to England and Buckingham Palace. Love it there. Please rest and remember that, and this is in caps, no one's business but yours and your husband and your beautiful family. So, yeah, I mean, there's
personal messages to the royals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't have a means of forwarding that on to Kate, but I'm sure the sentiment is appreciated.
It is strange. I mean, you can see from the kind of circus that's gone on over this episode with her and the kind of ongoing, the kind of darker sort of hate fest with Harry and Meghan, how much the royal industry depends on conflict and storylines, like any drama would. Lewis Goodall wrote a very good piece in last week's New Statesman headed "Monarchy is a state-sponsored tragedy." Does it look that way to you, from your slight distance, even though you've been here for ages?
It is in a way, and I think what I really actually appreciated about Lewis's piece was the fact that, unlike so many pieces talking about whether royals good or bad, he didn't center it on what the existence of the monarchy means for us, but rather what the existence of the institution means for them. I mean, sure, the institution is a good unifier of the people, but, is it good for the people at the center of it? What he calls a prison of gold, I think. Yeah. And, you just, when you recall everything that Prince Harry went through, and even I think back to that, is it Hilary Mantel, the British author, the one that made, the reference to, I remember, I think she wrote about the royal families liking them to pandas, saying that both are expensive to conserve and ill-suited to the modern world.
Also find it very hard to reproduce correctly, like pandas. Yeah.
Yeah. And we kind of like look at them like they're in a zoo. It's kind of hard to come to the conclusion that, yes, this is an institution that is really good for the people stuck inside of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a fundamental tension in there between what is sort of politely called modernisation, by which they mean making the royals accessible in a way that can somehow connect them to the people, which is essentially a democratic construct. You are saying, and this is why it was brilliant for the monarchy when Prince William, as he was, the Prince of Wales now, married Kate Middleton, who was a commoner, and this was seen as somehow a quiet, discreet revolution in the way in bringing monarchy to the wider nation in some way. Again, a democratic idiom. But ultimately, it can't possibly be a democratic institution. I mean, the whole concept is they have a regal bloodline that entitles them to rule anointed by God. Nothing about it is actually democratic. And so we all have to, or at least it's supporting the institution, you have to exist in that weird state of organized hypocrisy that says somehow this can move forward and connect with people while also fundamentally not changing the basic premise of it. And I think actually, in a way, a lot of damage was done to the institution without people realizing by all the speculation over whether it might have been a good idea to go straight to William and jump Charles after Elizabeth when she was still alive. Because once you even begin that kind of a conversation, you're talking about a recruitment drive, like who would be the best king or the best monarch? And the answer is the one who's born to do the job. Like literally, there's no other qualification. And so I do think there is these cracks appearing all over the place in the way that we discuss it and engage with it as if it can somehow be modern. And eventually that it will kind of collapse under those contradictions. Eventually, it just seems so hard to sustain that.
Things like messing around with the Champions League. Eventually people stop taking it seriously. Just get back to old school values, absolute right of monarchs and executions, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, also there is a kind of ahistoricism to it, isn't there? I mean, a lot of what we think of as ancient, venerable traditions going back forever, to 1066 or beyond, to Alfred, wherever you want to go, are sort of Victorian era inventions of empire to make the whole thing seem a little bit grander and more pompous, and to sort of persuade Victoria herself to sort of get on board as Empress of India. And actually, you go back to sort of the Georgian era, when the monarchy was just sort of at the apex of a bigger structure of aristocrats who had a slightly their own role in politics and society, and they were pretty unpopular, and some of them were really rubbish. And the early Georges didn't even really speak English, spent a lot of time in Hanover. So it comes and goes in waves and cycles. A lot of what we think of as having been there forever is actually relatively modern.
Yeah, that idea of being kind of the head of the national family and related to the people. 200 years ago, the monarch didn't give a toss about the common person, and before then it was just they ruled by divine right, and you just got on with it.
And an established church. I mean, ultimately, there are an awful lot of people who aren't Christians and an even bigger bunch of people who are just complete atheists in this country. So, yeah, some of it is pretty precarious, I think, deep down.
So any conversation about the future of the monarchy, as I said earlier, was very assiduously managed out of existence in the period between the death of the Queen and the coronation. First, it was too soon and disrespectful because the Queen had just died. Then we needed to give Charles time. Then it's the coronation and it's disrespectful again. And then the monarchy is secure for another cycle and it's too late to talk about it. Are we ever going to break out of that cycle of it's not the right time? And might it even be that, as Yasmeen was just saying, it's the cruelty to the participants. Many of whom, with the exception of people like Kate who married in, many of whom had no choice in this whatsoever, was simply born to it. And even when they do a Harry and they decide they don't want to be involved anymore, even then they're pursued and vilified.
I think it's too hard constitutionally to make compassion for the people doing it a factor, and actually public opinion, not just in this country but everywhere around the world, can be pretty heartless and cruel about that sort of thing. So there's an organized hypocrisy. You can feel terribly sad about all the intrusion and the prurience while frantically clicking and googling to find out what the conspiracy theory actually was. So no, I think it would take a constitutional affront on a scale where the royal family, the monarchy, found itself really on the wrong side of political decisions that exposed the scale of its power to start changing the way that conversation happens.
Yasmeen, polling on the royal family is quite interesting. YouGov do a tracker, and it has found that the royal family is good for Britain has declined from 61% of the population in 2019 to just 51% now. Neither good nor bad is up from 24% to 28%, not as significant. Bad is up from 10% to 16 to 17%. Do we think that's just the absence of the Queen effect, or is it something deeper?
I mean, I think the Queen's death does explain a lot of it. I mean, to Raf's point, this was a woman who was, venerated. And I think it was very difficult for whoever was going to replace her to fill her shoes, not least because they're simply not going to have the level of time. But also because, and I think this is where, and granted, I haven't been in the UK long enough to really remember the sort of, or even I kind of just remember the Diana period, but millennial.
Come on.
But yeah, but you know, the Queen seemed kind of unifying. Like I remember when she died, and even when I talked to ardent Republicans, they would happily say, "Look, I don't like the institution, but I really liked her. Like you know, she had a good run, and she served the country well, and et cetera, et cetera." But I think part of the problem is she was perhaps, you know, she personified the institution in a lot of ways, but it was also her that was unifying. So this institution is meant to be this national unifying thing, and perhaps to an extent still is, but the players involved, to my mind, aren't quite as unifying or as likable as she was. And I think that's perhaps part of the problem. And that's, you know, when I think about, you know, kind of on balance, is this a good institution? The thing that I heard over and over again when the Queen had passed was, you know, this is an institution that reflects British values, that that, you know, allows Britons to, in an era where we have a lot of division, particularly politically, that kind of binds the nation. But when I think back to the whole Kate Middleton saga, but even Harry and Meghan, none of that unifies. Like that's all divisive as well, all in a kind of a sort of pseudo-political way. So I would attribute it a lot to the Queen, but I don't know. But I mean, my impression also when I was like exploring this topic in the past was that there's a lot of apathy.
Yeah.
And I feel like the average Brit I talk to about this topic is apathetic.
Well, I think maybe they do sort of embody a real British value in a way that we don't really talk about, which is just hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way. You know, just please ignore the things going on around you and hope that they'll disappear. Just finally, I wanted to ask you, Yasmeen, the monarchy is it's an institution of duty, but the most prized quality today isn't duty, it's authenticity. It's being true to yourself. It's being true to your own personality and beliefs. Yet when Prince Harry exercises it and he walks away, he becomes the villain of the soap opera. Is there any way of kind of reconciling those two demands for duty and authenticity?
I don't think there is, because I don't think the institution lends itself well to authenticity. You know, when you see people being their authentic selves, especially on social media, like thinking back, one of the things that was most notable about the Queen is that we didn't actually know a lot about her. We didn't know her opinions. We maybe knew when she drank like a daily gin or whatever, but like, you know, that was kind of the extent of it. And you may have felt like you knew her because she was around for a long time. But in terms of like her like innermost thoughts and feelings, that was always subject to speculation. And I remember in kind of conversations that I've had when I was reporting on the latest Middleton saga was, you know, experts talked about how when William and Kate kind of took to Instagram, that one of the pluses and what made them perhaps seem more modern was the fact that they were being more authentic. They were posting their own, you know, family photos. And that ended up being kind of the crux of this massive crisis. So no, I don't think that those two things work well together, because to your point, you know, when you're authentic, you open yourself to being human, and humans have flaws. And this is an institution that, though I think people accept would has many flaws, I think it's vulnerable when it's seen to be a bit too, you know, human.
I think there's nothing more authentic than being crap at Photoshop on your phone. I very much related to that. Next up, it's time for that regular moment in the show where we choose our hero and villain of the week, who's been tidying up the world's grass verges and who's been fly tipping on the hard shoulder of life as we know it. Raf, who's your hero of the week and who's your villain of the week?
Well, for my hero, am I allowed to choose someone who's dead, but who did die last week?
Yeah.
Which is the now late Daniel Kahneman, the godfather of behavioral economics. He wasn't actually an economist, he was a psychologist. And he sort of pioneered the public understanding of the ways in which all kinds of cognitive biases and misjudgments infect our thinking that we don't even know about. His best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was, I think, a huge success with very good reason. And certainly it's one of the non-fiction books that I've read that really stayed with me for a long time and quite profoundly influenced the way I engage with politics, statistics, economics. He was a really, really smart guy and a great communicator. And those insights deserve proper respect. And villain, it's a bit obvious really, but I'm going to go for Robert Jenrick, who has proposed including immigration and visa status as part of crime gathering statistics, in a way that you just think someone's really sat down and thought hard about a way to take an issue that's already quite toxic and nasty, zeroing in on the potential conflation of migrants with crime, and sort of announcing something that won't happen, but in a way that will boost his profile with a certain group of people and really anger and annoy people like me who are duly annoyed about it and whine about it on this podcast. And it is just such a sort of precision targeted piece of petty, spiteful, nasty, pointless politics from a man who is really one of the most petty, spiteful, pointless, nasty people to have been elevated to cabinet level politics under this government.
Yasmeen, who are your nominations for hero and villain?
My hero for this week is the mayor of Istanbul, whose name I hope I'm not butchering when I say Ekrem İmamoğlu, who won re-election in recent local elections in Turkey, which was seen as actually kind of a huge loss overall for President Erdogan's ruling party. In countries like Turkey and Hungary, where we see a kind of competitive authoritarianism, effectively, where the playing field is tilted so heavily in the ruling leader's favor, whether it's Orban, whether it's Erdogan, it's actually quite nice to see that an opposition can still stage a comeback, or in this case, a really strong performance in the way that the Turkish opposition here has. And as for my villain, I hate to go if this feels like a cop-out, but I think just given everything that's happened today and in recent weeks, and given kind of a lot of the attention that's been paid to him recently, I'm going to go with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, his comments today with regard to the World Central Kitchen, saying that these things happen in war, which is more or less a paraphrase of what he actually said, I thought was quite insulting. The fact that for the Israeli public, the fact that the hostages aren't home, that he's been seen, as Senator Chuck Schumer said not too long ago, to be putting his own sort of personal survival ahead of the good of the country, and the good of the people there. He's peak villain of the week, of the month, perhaps even of the year. I don't know. We'll see how things go.
Well, you've given me on the villain side, you give me a very tough one there, because Robert Jenrick, Benjamin Netanyahu, I'm gonna give it to Jenrick, because I think it might be the last chance we have to put the boot into Jenrick, because he's clearly on the way out, and I don't think we'll have Jenrick to kick around for too much longer. Unfortunately, sadly, I think we'll have Netanyahu to kick around for quite a long time, and I think, again, very, very sadly, Netanyahu's perfidy is going to run and run. And I think, you can fully support wanting Israel to be safe and secure, and really, really dislike Benjamin Netanyahu. So Jenrick wins villain. On the hero side, I think I'm going to go for the mayor of Istanbul, who I'm not going to attempt to pronounce because I can't. But yeah, for a little bit of wink of light in the darkness, it's quite nice to see Erdogan get one in the eye. Now, are the boom times over for boomers? A generation used to having everything its own way is not happy, said The Economist recently, in a briefing which pointed out that the post-war Beatles and Kinks, multiple consumer boom, free education and home-owning generation might not have things all its own way in future. Baby boomers paid less in and took more out from the welfare state than any generation before or since, the magazine said. But boomers are now paying more tax, losing benefits and losing power as millennials begin to eclipse them. On paper, Jeremy Hunt is a 57-year-old Thatcherite and the finance minister of the Pensioners Party, said The Economist. In practice, he is Britain's first Millennial Chancellor. So what's going to happen, and what does it all mean, especially for the people who really count, which is Gen Xers like me and Raf? Raf, putting aside your Oasis box set for a second, we always have to preface discussions of boomers by saying, not you listeners, the other boomers, because, we have, otherwise we get complaints. But have we been living in a boomer state since the end of New Labour?
I think it's fair to say that as a cohort, with the exact caveat you mentioned, the boomers are historically an extraordinarily lucky generation, and that is across certainly the Western developed world, but particularly it has particular sort of wrinkles in this country because those who went to university got a free university education. If they entered the housing market, in the 1970s or 1980s, when they would have been sort of entering professional life and able to do that. They acquired assets that have earned a lot more than they will have done in their working lifetimes, just literally by accrual of inflation in the bricks and mortar. And they often get final salary pensions, and can retire in their 60s, or were able to retire in their 60s. And that generation, because there's a lot of them, as they then moved up through the cohorts and acquired power, they found that they were able to sort of protect each other through the levers of public office. So, yeah, I think it clearly there are lots of boomers who haven't done well, out of the various things we've just described. They maybe didn't buy council houses when they could have done all sorts of things. But yes, I think as a cohort, it's sort of unarguable that they've cornered the market in political and economic power for the last 20 or 30 years.
And the narrative is that those boomers experienced all of those things: unprecedented growth, free education, consumer boom, so forth, peace, and a free NHS. But they then voted Brexit to deny those things to the rest of us, to kind of like put us on a downward trajectory. It is a caricature. But have we, to an extent in our politics, been paying the price of the raised expectations of that cohort, that that not only that things will always get better, but that things will always be centered on them?
Yeah, I think that's a little bit more complicated, just because it's sort of normal for there's a sort of natural risk aversion that people who have stuff will politically behave in ways that they think will protect it, or if you no longer think you're going to want to go and live and work abroad in the EU, or you're already retired, you might not perceive the benefits of European Union membership as much. And so I wouldn't necessarily, I think what's more interesting in a way is the sense that now that they are sitting on, that cohort is sitting on a big pile of asset wealth in particular, and we've had the financial crisis, we've had austerity, we've got very, very low growth, so some money has to come from somewhere to actually finance the states and the services that actually the country comes to expect, including the boomers themselves, who are going to start putting a lot of pressure on the NHS. Like that money, if that money's coming from somewhere and they've got all the money, they're going to have to pony up. And that is actually, you can see that as in cultural terms, as sort of millennials starting to get their own back against the boomers. But actually, I think, again, it's just a sort of any chancellor looking around, or any policymaker looking around at, for example, the cost of social care. Eventually, it is going to be the case, one way or another, that the people who own the houses are going to basically have to liquidate some of their housing wealth to pay for their social care. Now, no one in politics is currently saying that, but that is definitely going to happen, because that's where the money is.
Yeah, and actually it's a way to completely obliterate your political career, as Theresa May found out very quickly when she advanced it in the 2017 election.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is awkward, particularly for the Conservatives, because if you look at the polling now, pretty much the only people who still say they will vote Conservative are over 60, actually over 65, I think. And so, again, I mean, you referenced that piece in The Economist. I think it overstates quite strongly the case by saying Jeremy Hunt is the first Millennial Chancellor. I mean, clearly there are all sorts of things that a government could do to protect or help people who, for example, are renting and don't own accommodation, or who have massive student debts that they're going to have to be paying off for a long time, with incredibly brutal marginal tax rates as a result of that, right? Jeremy Hunt is not doing anything about those things. He's not a Millennial Chancellor. But, it is the case that he's made some choices that mean that actually, where, as I say, where the money is, that's where you've got to get it from. And when you have a Labour government, and if those over 65s are the only people left voting Conservative, and they live in the few remaining constituencies that are going to be safe Tory seats, there's just not the incentives there for a Keir Starmer administration to give them what they want anymore, whereas there will be a lot of incentives for a Keir Starmer administration to pay attention to the people who voted them in, and that will be a younger cohort.
I think that line about Millennial Chancellor was somebody at The Economist getting carried away. It's a very good line, as is the crosshead. The future is a very expensive trainer stamping on a human face forever. I thought,
was very good.
Great line, but maybe a little bit on the extreme side. Yasmeen, the Boomer cohort, again, asterisk, not all of them.
Hashtag not all boomers.
Hashtag not all boomers. Have also been closely connected to the rise of Trump conservative populism, not just in America and Britain, but across the world. Do you think this is purely to do with mass property ownership and the fact that, once the political weather darkens, you become more frightened and more conservative and you go for an authoritarian answer? Or is it something more deeper and more kind of psychological, the idea that you are a special generation effect.
I think it's that and then some. I mean, at least in the U.S. context, I very much got the impression that Trump spoke to a generation who kind of shared the idea that he did, that things were better back then, and that, the kind of changes that are happening currently are not only scary but threatening to America and to the America that you recognize. So I think that was part of it. But I think you also kind of have to look at the demographics. I mean, it was older Americans tend to vote more, but they also are less likely to be Black, Hispanic, or Asian, or all groups that are not only tend to be representative of younger voters, but who also tend to vote Democrat. So I think there's a bit of that as well. I just think a lot of the issues that tend to trend Republican, which also tend to trend older, there's a lot of concerns about, I feel like you hear Republicans talking a lot about, trend, like kind of trans people, sexual orientation and gender identity generally. There's obviously concerns around immigration, but I feel like a lot of it harkens back to this idea of, we need to make America great again. And the America that your generation remembers and that you grew up in is better than the America that we're currently living in.
What I find weird, I visit America a lot because my wife's American. I see the in-laws, and he's watching TV or just absorbing the world of popular culture. You see far more kind of boomer propaganda in the States than you do here. You hear all the time, we did Woodstock and we stopped the Vietnam War. And I think, yeah, and now you're all voting for Trump. What's going on? I mean, there's a disjuncture going on there. But it does seem that the conversation is so much more boomer-centered than it is here.
To an extent. I mean, I thought when you said you were watching American TV, you also saw like all the medication commercials, which are also targeting like much
loads
older
of
Americans.
Everybody's a silver fox. They're always laughing on a boat, going, "I'm having more sex than I've ever had," or rather implying I'm having more sex than I've ever had. There's a lot of that, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's very weird going home and just seeing those adverts generally because I'm like, oh right, I forgot that this is the thing that we do. But I mean, I think to your overall point, I mean, yes, in a way they do dominate the culture, but I mean. And maybe this is just, again, because I'm a millennial. I don't know. Sorry, I will stop this. I kind of also feel like their dominance is limited. Certainly, I mean, among the younger generation. And I don't know to what extent the fact that they feel like they're losing that dominance is why there's this kind of last gasp. We need to go for Trump or some sort of kind of extreme version to sort of take us back. But, you look at sort of going back to Hollywood, you look at all like the kind of up and coming, like the new stars that the Timothy Chalamet's, the Zendayas, the Florence. I mean, these are, granted, I think those first two are probably even Gen Z. But even if you look at like who's kind of taking over like the music industry, Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, Drake, these are all millennials. So in a way, and then, you even go to social media and the boomers, apart from Facebook, don't really exist there. So I think a lot of like what is sort of developing. I mean, yes, in terms of ideas of like what America is, I'm sure like some of that, kind of older stuff does insert itself. But I also think they probably feel like they're falling behind. Yeah. And it doesn't help when you have a generation like Gen Z communicating in a way that they can't understand, let alone I can't understand, which, probably doesn't help. But
I think it's incredibly complicated, though, because, very crudely speaking, the liberalism within the boomer generation won the first round of the culture war. So the sort of progressive late 60s, early 70s, the idea of that generation is incredibly progressive, all smoking pot, all, what fed into that particular mythology, the Woodstock iconography, is one branding of that cohort, and yet actually immensely conservative Reaganite capitalism massively won the economic round of the first sort of phase of culture war. And it's the same generation, really, in terms of big picture. And so each side gets to feel a little bit aggrieved. So, the economic conservatives basically felt that they had, licentious Bill Clintonism and liberal establishment run everything. And you have that a little bit in this country too. And liberals get to think, well, basically, all the sort of stuffy conservatives actually run everything. So everyone sort of slightly feels that they're owed a swing of the pendulum. So and that's within one generation.
Yeah, basically, it's all Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire" as a massive argument in a gigantic country.
Well, I think, and that's actually why Gen X is such an interesting phenomenon. I would say that because
Well, thank you.
why
I was
we are
feeling,
actually the most important generation.
yeah.
And no, it's because actually I do think there is a sense in which those of, I mean, I was born in 1974, and Gen X basically go late 60s up to about 1980. One of the defining features of Gen X is supposed to be, I think, this sense that because their parents were boomers who were actually terribly liberal and won that, they are sort of post-Woodstock permissive people. And actually also they were raised in that long post-war boom into the 1980s, into the post-Cold War era, into the 90s, where actually there was peace. There was a general dividend of the Cold War being over and everything was good. They didn't really have anything to rebel against. And so they ended up just rebelling against everything in a snarky, satirical, slacker style. I mean, the term Gen X was actually coined by an American...
Douglas Coupland.
Douglas Coupland gave the
he
title to the book, but he pinched it from a historian journalist called Paul Fussell.
He digitally sampled it.
Yeah, and he who described, I've actually got the quote here, described Gen X. He says, we are impelled by insolence, intelligence, irony, and spirit. I think, yeah, I'll take that.
Right,
What a cool generation. It's also quite interesting in this country how all of the sort of misbehavioral social dysfunction stats really peak in Gen X. So teenage pregnancy, recreational drug use, underage drinking. Gen X absolutely hold the record for that. The millennials and Gen Z are way more Puritan and way better behaved, work harder than Gen X. We really are the absolute waster generation, which I'm afraid I must concede I take a little bit of pride.
Same here. Well, I do find it interesting that kind of the American Generation X and British generation are very, very different, aren't they? American Generation X is supposed to be disaffected and doesn't believe in anything anymore. British Generation X, we had a fantastic time. It was enjoyment, colour, excitement, fantastic music, and not exactly idealism, but certainly a belief that things could only get better.
Second Summer of Love,
absolutely, and a third and a fourth one as well. All of which were absolutely fantastic.
If you remember those ones, you definitely weren't there.
Yeah, well, I just kept setting up another different Summer of Love every other year. Back to the boomers, though. I mean, there's a live example in the shift in emphasis away from boomers in Britain, at least in the Wasby Women situation. So some 4 million women whose retirement age was put up as part of government financial planning. They're now being offered between £1,000 and £3,000 compensation, not the £10,000 that they've been claiming. This is developing into a scandal. Raf, give us the kind of quick the executive summary here.
Yeah, okay, so the very short version, in the post-war welfare state, there was a different retirement age for men and women, 60 for women, 65 for men. At the very end of the John Major government, there was a Pensions Act which said actually at some stage you're going to have to equalise that. It no longer really makes sense to have those as different ages, but it will be phased in over a long period of time so women don't suddenly get thrown off this sort of cliff edge of no pension provision right at the end of their working lives when they hit 60, then going into the sort of early coalition George Osborne austerity years where it was all about how can we save as much money as possible. Bluntly speaking, the government went, actually, let's throw them off a cliff edge anyway. Come to think about it, why not? And massively shrunk the period of transition, which meant women, the Wasby Women, Wasby being an acronym for Women Against State Pension Inequality, who say they weren't given anywhere near adequate warning of this or any warning at all in some cases, who were just about to hit their retirement told, actually, sorry, you can't retire. And they basically want their money. And just actually last month, I think, the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman reported saying, yeah, you owe them some money, government, and the government has preempted that by saying, no, we're not giving them money. No one's getting any money. And so this is now left hanging, as you say, with it's not a vast number of people, but it is a distinct cohort of women of that age, born in the mid 1950s mostly, who quite rightly, I think, feel quite stitched up by what happened.
But if the Tory party really was the pensioner party that we've kind of imagined it to be over the past few years, you'd imagine it would immediately turn around and go, yes, fantastic, fine, you are our core client vote. Take the compensation. And the fact that they are not doing so indicates that maybe there is a bit of a shift in the air. Or is it just that there's a letter somewhere saying there's no money left?
I think it's probably more that there aren't quite enough of them and they aren't distributed enough in sort of, if they were all in one marginal seat, they'd probably find some money for them. Bluntly speaking, I suspect it will be it'll be that order of calculation rather than a more general observation about we've given pensioners enough, thank you very much. I mean, again, you look at the argument about the triple lock. It's not the most expensive. So this is, just again, I'm sure people know generally, but it means that the pension has to rise with either in line with inflation earnings, or is it 2%, 2.5%?
2.5%, I think.
And whichever is the highest. And it ratchets the pension up, but actually by European standards, it ratchets it up at a relatively low level. I mean, so you can make the case either way. You can say this is a government that's throwing money at pensioners, or this is a government that is as mean to pensioners as it is to everyone else.
Yasmeen, just in closing, you're a millennial, as we have heard. Are you looking forward to your moment of political total hegemony when it's all laid out for you, speaking now as the voice of your generation?
I mean, yes, but it also feels light years away. I mean, we've talked about how American politics skews a lot older, not just in our octogenarian presidential candidates, but even if you just look at the makeup of Congress and kind of American politics writ large, I mean, there aren't a lot of millennials really present. So, in the current Congress, there are just 52 millennial members in the House of Representatives out of 435. And I think there's one Gen Z member. And the median age of that chamber is around 58, I think. And kind of similarly in the Senate, I think the boomers continue to dominate. There are 66 boomer senators out of 100. So yes, but it also feel like it's going to take a while for millennials to really feel like they've gotten that foothold. God knows how old we'll be by the time that happens.
We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for Escape Routes. What are the mental balms and salves from the world of TV, movies, entertainment, books, or whatever that Yasmeen and Raf have been using to escape from the hellscape that is politics and current affairs? Yasmeen.
So I'm a bad American. I don't typically watch Saturday Night Live, but I did over the weekend. And I would have recommended everyone do so, at least the monologue, because it was Egyptian-American comedian Rami Youssef. And he, in his monologue, I think as was expected, kind of broached sort of Gaza, Israel. And I thought he did it just in such an empathetic and thoughtful way, calling for, to free all the people of Palestine was, I think, was language to free all the Israeli hostages. I thought it was a really thoughtful, well done monologue. So that's what I watched a couple of times, I must admit.
And they're all over YouTube now. The SNL opens and monologues, aren't they? Yeah, really, really worth seeing. Raf, how about you?
Yeah, mine's a little bit lower brow than that. No, I for the first time in a long, long time, I watched the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, which I normally, on telly. I didn't actually go down to the Thames to watch it. Normally, I'd struggle to care less about the outcome, but I found myself watching it.
Why can't they both lose?
Exactly. And what I found was I was reminded that there's some in almost any sport, if you decide you're interested, you can find yourself caring about it. And I was reminded that we've got the Olympics coming this summer. My favorite thing about the Olympics is turning it on in the middle of the afternoon and finding myself massively interested in some totally obscure sport where I don't even know what the rules are. Part of the fun of watching it is even working out how they're getting the points, the competitive kayaking or whatever it is. And so, yes, the kind of slightly pointless sports that somehow make themselves entertaining to the spectator in pursuit of escapism.
We are going to get a lot of letters from the competitive kayaking listeners. They'll get really, really angry.
I loved the competitive kayaking in the Olympics. I just still didn't understand it. You're always like curling in the Winter Olympics. Great sport.
Don't say curling. They'll go mad. No, curling is brilliant. Curling's fascinating. Curling's hypnotic. You can just you start watching the curling and it's like 3:00 in the morning and you're still watching the curling. Better
exactly.
Than
It's who else wields a broom in competitive sport with such vigor and discipline? Answer: no one outside curling. I'm confident.
My escape route is it's pop music. It's a reissue. This is a very Gen X choice as well. The fantastic electronic band, house band, Electribe 101 from Birmingham put out a classic album in 1990 called Electribal Memories. If you were around then, you may know Talking With Myself, which is one of the absolute great sort of semi-ambient club tunes. Anyway, it's just been re-released in a 4 CD set with literally so many extra versions and additional things that you can devote an entire weekend to, which I have just done. It is just the most luxuriant and sensual house music you could wish to listen to. And now it comes with a whole load of like the remixes by people like Marshall Jefferson and Frankie Knuckles and Larry Heard, these absolute gods of house music. And it's available in a shop near you right now. That's Electribal Memories by Electribe 101. Give it a go.
Electribe is such an early 90s sound. I bet they were played at the Whirly gig in Shoreditch Town Hall in the late 1980s.
Yeah,
I bet you went to the Whirly gig, didn't you?
Actually, I was not so much Whirly gig, not so much kind of juggling beanbags, bit more techno for me, bit more.
Oh, really?
Bit more
Spiral
banging.
Tribe? Yeah, were you down with the Spiral Tribe?
No, I was much more kind of Sabersonic type of person,
Okay,
kind of thing, with my bowl-head haircut. The listeners are now tuning out in their millions. But no, Electro 101, named after a synthesizer, as all the best bands are, like the Prodigy, named after a synthesizer. Anyway, listeners, go and get it. You are going to love it. And that is the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you to Yasmeen Serhan.
Thanks.
And thank you to Rafael Behr.
Thank you.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Thursday for our Patreon backers and Friday morning for everybody else. Don't forget, we could really use your support. Go to the link in the show notes to find out how to back us. You'll be helping us to keep the lights on here in the Oh God, What Now command module, and you'll get a special shot from the panel too.
A big thank you to Rachel Wright, David Barrow, Ashley Skirra, or Sirra, depending on how you pronounce your name, and Guy Jackson.
Big shout from me, and thanks for defying the cost of living crisis to support Oh God, What Now? To David Fogarty, Loza, Cindy Butts, and Mike.
And finally, hello and welcome from me to new supporter Keith, perhaps Sir Keith, who knows, and returning Patreons who've come back to the fold, Ian Brunsden, Chris Jobling, who's back for the 3rd time, and Daniel O'Brien. We'll see you next time.